How did David Foster Wallace deal with being exceptionally smart in the 21st century? Because, as I'm sure you already know, a lot of people today categorize intelligence with pretentiousness. And we'll hear today from David Foster Wallace on how, as a smart person, you have to jump around everyone and put up false signals to show, hey, I'm smart, but I'm the cool smart person. I'm not a jerk. Don't feel bad about not being smart. And I remember 12 years ago when I first started reading David Foster Wallace, I was like, oh my God, who is this guy? And I gave Infinite Jest to my friends, my sister, my dad. And some of them tried to read it, but nobody really got it. So I felt really isolated. And here on this channel, though, I am building a David Foster Wallace community. This is the headquarters of everything related to Wallace on YouTube. So if you are interested in more videos, there's a playlist down below that you can look at when you are done with this video. But while in that isolation, you can decide to make two different choices. You can be kind of weird Reddit bro engineer that doubles down and says, I don't care, or you have to adapt. And just in a second, we are going to hear David Foster Wallace speak at length in a clip longer than usual about how to grapple with these two choices. So here we go.
I find what you're saying flattering, but I think you're overestimating some of the like this thing about the constant self-consciousness and apology. Somebody at the reading in San Francisco last night was very acute and made me very uncomfortable because she talked about the second essay in the book, which is this big thing about writing fiction when you've watched a lot of TV and you live in this kind of very hip, ironic culture and how hip irony can become toxic and blah, blah, blah. I won't rehash the argument. But she pointed out that, you know, this essay makes that argument, and then a great deal of the rest of the essays in the book employ a certain kind of hip, ironic self-consciousness that is, that to me isn't that attractive. And the apologizing for being smart, I think, can very easily become trying to head off potential criticism from you by acknowledging that I can get there first and deprecate myself so that you don't get a chance to do it. And it's very much of a piece with a certain kind of insecurity, what to me seems like a very American insecurity that I have fully internalized, where I'm so terrified of your judgment that if I can show some kind of hip, self-aware, self-conscious judgment of myself first, I somehow am defended against your ridiculing me or parodying me or something like that. To the extent that I don't think I'm the only person who suffers from that, it may be effective, but a great deal of it, I think, that's expressive stuff that I'm not comfortable with. I think a lot of that's just a tick about my own psychology that I think my work would be better if there wasn't quite so much of that in there, because it really is manipulative. I mean, it is acting out of terror of another's judgment and trying to look as if he can't possibly come up with a criticism of you having to do with how you appear that you haven't gotten there first. I think, I mean, I agree with you, and I think Wittgenstein's Mistress is a magical book, not because it alternates between incredible intellectual stunt pilotry and pathos, but because it manages to marry the two in a way that, I mean, that's what my dream is, to someday be able to do something like that. I think there's a difference, though, between the kind of self-consciousness that you're talking about in Wittgenstein's Mistress, or notebooks of, you know, Multalores Briggs, or A Hunger Artist, or The Metamorphosis. The self-consciousness there is a far sort of deeper, wiser, it's a more autonomous, almost solipsistic self-consciousness. The kind that I'm talking about is far more concerned with the perception by others, what others' judgments are of you. It's a way of kind of positioning oneself to prevent something terrible happening that only you think is going to happen or something. And I think we need more words for self-consciousness the way Eskimos have for snow, because I think you're right. There are some kinds of self-consciousness that are much, it's more like self-awareness, or a kind of deep, a very involved, sophisticated acceptance of human limitation, versus I want to make a certain kind of impression. You know, I want to show you, number one, I'm very smart, but number two, I'm not pretentious at all and not hung up on myself. So I will therefore, every time I say something erudite, make very clear to you that I'm not all puffed up, because if for a moment I show myself as puffed up, well, we know from watching American sitcoms what happens to the character who shows himself as puffed up or pretentious. I mean, the analogy is somewhat forced, but I think there are moments in some of my later stuff where I've managed to hit a note of that kind of self-consciousness that for me is wise and timeless. But there's also times when I know that I get scared, and I'm positioning myself a certain way, particularly in the nonfiction, that I don't think that's interesting or productive self-consciousness. In a perverse way, though, I think it's mimetic of a very kind of late 20th century American experience, which is, I think this is a time when we're terribly afraid of one another. And there seem to be very few venues for talking about it. And so if betraying some of that neurosis in these essays is at least a way of inviting some kind of conversation between me and the reader about it, that's one thing. But I also know that I'm very bright, but I'm also terrified of coming off as somebody who thinks he's very bright, because people who think they're very bright are buttholes.
So in this cultural hypnotic system that we have been raised in, you are not allowed to excel fully in mental, physical, spiritual, or emotional growth. You have to be making these self-conscious concessions all the time and be limiting yourself for the weak. People always say the society is built for the strong and people are being exploited. But if you actually look at society, it's been created so that people who don't try can succeed, or at least get to a lower middle class, upper lower class level by just following the lines in front of them. And when we look at media and how people who are pretentious, people who are acting themselves, because if you were having a discussion with someone and you know they have no idea what they're talking about, let's say you're very knowledgeable on the subject, you're not necessarily allowed to go full out until they give you the concession. You maybe try and hint and show them that you know a lot about this, but sometimes people don't care. People don't tip the hat to you. So you have to listen to them talk because they have no listening or communication skills. When I'm dealing with an expert, someone who knows something, way more than I do, I just am a sponge. I'm sitting there and listening like, okay. But to be able to do that means that you have a respect for the art, whatever it is. And so I do this all the time when I know, when I'm talking to certain people about knowledge and they're like, how do you know so much? And sometimes I say that before, well, I just go home all day. Like, what do you do? I just go home and read and write all day. And that's actually not what I do. But I have to act like I'm some hermit who does nothing except read and write. And I have all this commitment to knowledge. So it doesn't seem like I'm pretentious, and I have to say it quietly. And like, you guys play these games all the time. And this actually transcends the physical level. In 2014, when I was 21, just like right when I turned 21, I got a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Back before it was as popular as it was now. And I remember these like 30-year-old dudes who like had won every fight they'd ever been in, and they were jacked and strong and motivated, would come in and I'd be able to just beat them easily. But during the conversation after, I was supposed to say, it's just because I'm younger. It's because I'm 6'3". It's because I'm more flexible than you, or yada, yada, yada. I wasn't saying to them, hey, well, you're going out and partying and eating McDonald's and not caring about anything in life and not paying attention to the techniques and spacing out. I'm sitting here grinding 6 hours a day. When I go home, I'm studying film. This is all I think about. And that's why I'm way better than you and why you'll never catch up to me. That's the truth about what's going on. That's the truth when you're talking to people about intellectual things. But we have to sit here and do this proper etiquette, because there are these weird people out there like these Reddit bros who that's their whole personality. They have no personality except just logically attacking people. And they kind of ruined it for everybody. And I don't know if back like in the 60s and 70s and 80s when like a lot of this media was being created, if like people with autism and stuff were like undiagnosed and like that was just kind of one of these stigmas about people who had like problems communicating and maybe were really smart but just didn't have the emotion and stuff to be able to push it, like if that created the stigma. But we live in a time now, if you look at our two presidents, they're Trump and Biden, they're idiots. Even if you like them, even if you think they're going to do something good, if you ask them about intellectual things, they have no idea what's going on. They've not made that a priority in their life. And honestly, if we go back, no president had. I remember Barack Obama talking about he only read critical theory because he really liked this girl that was into it. The intellectual meritocracy in any field of government, really in a lot of fields of even the private sector, is not rewarded. It's more the ability to communicate and how to manage power and be, all these other types of things that are rewarded in terms of reaching the top positions. And I understand that being a manager, being a leader is a whole separate other thing than just being an engineer, because there are lots of engineers out there who just who can never communicate or manage or lead anything. But it's for sure not a value we really reward in America or the Western world anymore. And as I've talked about before, it's because, in my opinion, intelligence got placed in a competitive framing since the start of time with grades, with the school system. Johnny's better than Julie because, in second grade, maybe a kid was struggling with reading, but it's only the second grade. Maybe his parents were bad or something. didn't really spend enough time with him, or maybe they did and he's just struggling. But then he sees Julie, and Julie can read, and Julie's getting good grades and getting more attention and more affirmation. And so this little thing starts to fester. Then as you get into high school, there's the valedictorian. What are you ranked? You're ranked 800th out of 850. You must be an idiot. Are you even going to college? Then there's this idea of college and all these other things, and we feel those people in high school. So I was there. The kids in high school who were trying so hard to get grades and be the valedictorian, you could just tell that like they actually don't care. Like it was very off-putting to me as someone who wanted to be like an independent thinker. Like, why are you just following these rules and not actually growing in your personal life? Because okay, get straight A's, but why don't you care about the stuff outside of school? And then obviously there are bad teachers and other traumatizing situations throughout the 12 years of school where you're just exposed to a wide variety of people and situations, and all that's tethered to intellectualism. And most of us don't come out of it being like, wow, that was great. Like my teachers really instilled this love of books or math, and everyone was really supportive of me on my journey, unless you got really lucky. And so when people view it now, they view it on the same level as football and sports. And intellectualism is scary because someone can overpower you. What if someone could, knows more about everything that you know about and can psychologically break you down? And people can't handle this. I know a lot of this goes on in religion also. When you have someone who's very pious, someone who's very religious and like studies a bunch into it, and then they're talking to normal people, sometimes those people feel weird because they don't feel like they're good enough, that they're being judged by this person. And there's a whole anti-knowledge sector in just Christianity in general, because a lot of these factions reject a lot of these bigger principles. Like how many people in the West are talking about like a lot of the really great stuff in like Eastern Orthodoxy that can really create transformation in the soul? How many of these mega churches are even just talking about some of the more important psychological stuff in general? And it's because they're resisting. They don't like the people that know more. They don't like the highest level of it. Same goes with emotional intelligence. Why do you think men reject women so much? Why do you think one of the reasons women were oppressed for so long and still are oppressed, not in terms of laws, but just in the household and how people treat them, is that they are much more perceiving than men. And so we try to just act like they don't know what they're doing. Like, woman, you don't have any experience, or you're not making the money, you can't make the decisions. And millions of men today in America are going to do that to their wife because they are scared of their emotional perception. And so it puts us as people who are focused on these 4 areas of growth in a very funky situation, because we have to push the limits a little bit, because we can't sit here, because when you're in this analysis paralysis where you're always worried about what everyone else is thinking and being too self-conscious, you may end up like David Foster Wallace. And do you make concessions to the people that are just kind of being babies about the whole thing? And the answer is no. So you have to push the expectations a little bit. You have to be brave and courageous in these regards. And you have to expect that you're going to get called all the different words: know-it-all, elitist, gatekeeper, whatever else. Give me some names. Tell me some experiences where people rejected your intelligence, didn't really respect it. I mean, this is another thing with parents. Like a lot of kids are, especially because I've seen this a million times, not just in my own life, but with a lot of my students, is you have a student and they're very bright. They are like studying and they're really into like, whether it's emotional or intellectual stuff. And then they have their parents who never really took that stuff seriously or haven't since high school, and basically have just been floating in space without growing. And their kids are maybe just way better than them, way more intellectual than them. And so the parents take it out on them. The parents don't allow that to kind of grow, and then start, rejecting the things they want to do and telling them, no, you're going to do this. And it's a really sad thing to see children stifled by their parents. I have witnessed some of the most heartbreaking stuff I've witnessed as a teacher is kids who could have become something, and maybe they will one day, but they fell under the pressure to their parents. I've known so many kids who were way more talented than I ever was, or most of the kids in a school are, but their parents said, you're going to the military. And so right now, one of these kids, who's probably one of the smartest students I've ever had, one of the most talented, is being a guard of an Air Force base somewhere in the Middle East. He just stands for 8 hours a day with a gun. And that's his life for the next, 4 years. He had a 6-year contract. And then his parents have this whole other plan when he gets out. They're already making him and he's not allowed to spend his money. He's going to invest it into real estate. He has his whole life plan laid out. But if they actually looked at him and talked to him and supported him, this dude could have been any career. This guy could have been making real money or making real impact or being really happy or really creative. But instead, his dumb parents, and I met them, are total idiots, have such big egos that they won't let him grow. And if you're not one of these kind of weird incel Reddit bros, kind of autistic type people who doesn't really tap into intelligence and can't be empathetic, then you actually have a decent control over your ego. We obviously let our ego, out sometimes, some of the malignant parts of our personality. But part of this growth, if you're growing in those 4 sectors, it's about reining that in and then unleashing it at a certain time. But the problem with that is when you rein in your ego, when you start to do all this, what happens? Oh, wait, you're controlled by the people who have the big ego. The Donald Trumps, the Joe Bidens, the politicians, the rulers, the managerial class. They rule over the creatives because all they do is inflate their ego. They shut off their emotions and they can attack and keep people down who aren't playing this same crazy power game. And so it's about finding that balance and trying to sometimes disguise what you're doing or just being totally overt with it. I just made a video criticizing Wendy Goon's video on Blood Meridian, and I just have a ton of hate comments in there. Everyone's calling me an elitist and a gatekeeper and making fun of how smart I am. And because I didn't make enough concessions at the start of the video. I made some. I already knew it was going to be a problem. So I was like, hey, our job here is to stand on the shoulders of scholars. There are people out there who've been studying Cormac their entire lives and will never be able to be as smart as them. But we have to try to get to their level. We have to look to them. We can't look across around the room and make summary videos. We have to try and at least, aspire toward them. But everyone saw that as attacking the little man. And then I also took shots at everybody, like personal shots. But I think that's what it's going to take, everybody. There's this wall and there's this massive resistance, there with all these influencers and all these people who get power because they are the common everyday dumb man. They resonate with everyone and they help everyone stay unconscious. And at times they have consciousness. At times they are bright. But they've filled the positions of power and of influence. And so we, as people who are focused on those 4 areas of growth at an authentic level and are trying to share that and help lift people up instead of just pacify people into, passive consumption, our job isn't to sit down here and try and build the people and say, we're going to rise up. We have to actually push ourselves into those positions and say, these people don't deserve this. And obviously there's going to be pushback and there's going to be problems, but there's been such a hypnosis that's been put over people that we're going to have to go a little bit more extreme to be able to wake people up. You're going to have to be a little bit more on this side than on this self-consciousness side that David Foster Wallace is talking about, because he's making these concessions. And I know people who do this all the time. Before you're able to criticize them, they've already made the criticisms themselves, and then they've kind of framed it in a way and kind of created the straw man argument or like a slippery slope or something so that you can't really bring up the argument in an authentic way. And you and I have done this before, I know, and we don't need to do that anymore. We don't need to run around scared of the people who actually didn't grow, of the people who are going to say these things who are just unconscious anons running around. And there is a sense of urgency because with AI coming, every single one of my kids, if I'm not monitoring heavily, and I know a lot of kids, at least 70% of my kids just use AI in classes that don't have the teacher checking every single word and of papers. At least 90% of kids now in high school aren't even writing, aren't even reading. I know kids whose teachers don't care and they just don't do assignments. They haven't done an assignment for years in high school, and they're just cruising with AI and cheating and taking F sometimes when they can't use AI if it's like an in-class assignment. And that's our future. And eventually intellectualism is going to be replaced by computers, and being intellectual is going to now start being equated with the whole computer class and being this unemotional person because no one needs to use it anymore. And eventually, when AI gets powerful enough, governments and other things are going to do power grabs, and we're almost going to stay in this homeostasis in terms of the amount of upward mobility we have in terms of creating an educational awakening. The window is getting smaller and smaller, I feel like, to make these things happen. And that's why this sense of urgency, this is why being a little bit more confrontational and calling people out and being a know-it-all or a jerk or any of these things is important, because we've had people for decades now making concessions, falling into the excuses. Everyone's got an excuse now. Everyone has a disability now. ADD, ADHD, ZZY, PPY2189. Everyone's got something. Your mom died when you were 3. I had traumatic brain injuries. I could have sat there and said, hey, I can never read again. I could have sat there, but I didn't. And you guys have had stuff in your life too that you could have used as a crutch, as an excuse, but you didn't either. And we can hold that same expectation for other people, because we may be jerks. I may be an elitist or a gatekeeper or any of these other things. but there is going to be more suffering. The less people grow in those 4 areas is just going to mean more suffering in the future, more abuse, more unconscious thought, and more of an ability to be overtaken by negative forces, whether they are spiritual or physical. So that's one of the main motivating factors for me for this channel. I'm imagining the amount of suffering that I'm creating if I don't get it together, if I don't try harder, if I don't do better, because that's what's going to happen. And it's kind of a weird negative scarcity framing, but it's the truth of most likely what's going to happen, because I witness it on the ground every day. I would like to tell you guys that it's better now, that high school is better now and everyone's more kind, and like in this awakened age where everyone's accepted, that it's better. In some regards it is. People like gay people or like whoever are more accepted now. Yeah, like they don't necessarily get as bullied as much for those certain things. But if everyone isn't as conscious, if everyone doesn't understand empathy, which is learned through emotional intelligence and mental intelligence, or how to control themselves through physical intelligence, or their purpose in life because of spiritual intelligence, you know how many problems that creates? You know how much inner violence and turmoil that creates? That's being stifled and numbed with the phones, but at a later time is going to result in them taking abusive action toward themselves, others, or just totally shutting down into a state of paralysis and not wanting to grow at all. That's the most horrific reality there can be. And that's what digital technology more and more is leading us towards. Just so because someone's pacified with the phone doesn't mean that they're going to stay that way forever. Domestic abuse, all the big problems, they haven't been solved yet. Those rates aren't going down. We're not figuring it out, even though everyone's more accepting now and like all these other things. It's because raise is a verb. To raise yourself into higher consciousness requires you to do something, and it's going to be hard, and it's going to hurt your ego. You're going to have to let yourself be mentored by people, whether in books or in person, who are better than you. And then one day you'll be better than other people in whatever respective area that you're applying yourself in. It's not hard. So what are your guys' thoughts? How can we grow with this self-consciousness? How can we live as geniuses, as creative geniuses? That's what I like to think of myself as. I'm trying to grow in all 4 of those fields. But how can I do that in a society that doesn't necessarily care, and where the idea of that is now being actively pushed against? So thank you guys for being here, of course, and I will see you guys in the next video.